One of the questions that many viewers pose to me, either via email or telephone conversations, or perhaps even at the trade shows: why is it that I spend so little time fitting up my various components, such as a mortise and tenon joint? Why is it that I don't have to go through all that fitting when I machine the part and then assemble it? And for the longest time, I was having a tough time answering that question, other than just simply stating, well, I machine it to size to begin with, and then I don't have to go through that fitting process. But that isn't quite the whole answer, and it took me some time to really reflect back on the past few years of woodworking as to what I'm doing differently today that I wasn't doing years back, that allowed me to machine a joint, assemble it, and have it fit without spending so much time with all the fussing of fitting. And it boiled down to, I'm measuring my parts much more accurately today than I did 10 or 15 years ago. As a woodworker, we more often than not work with our basic tape measure and our rule, or if you're a machinist, you would call this a scale. With these tools, the measurement or the precision that you can get out of these tools is pretty coarse, especially when you start considering fit and how two components have to fit together. With the dial caliper, you're measuring literally into the thousandths of an inch. These tools are very universal. Machinists use them and live by them in their daily lives of producing very precise components out of just about any material known to man. I've been using them in woodworking for many years now. I was also a machinist many years back, so it's a second nature tool to me. However, many woodworkers frown upon using precision tools, and I frankly do not understand that belief system that using a precision measuring instrument is bad in woodworking. It's really no more different than using a nice scale to do your measuring and marking and layout. It's just in this case, the scale is more finely calibrated, more precise, and it's easier to read, especially for those of us whose eyes are starting to show signs of age. Now I'll bring you in a little closer and I'll show you some of my calipers that I've been using over the years. Here are my 3 dial calipers that I use most frequently, and then one of the more contemporary counterparts to it, a digital caliper. Now first let me explain a little bit about these. These two are what's called a 6-inch model. This one's an 8-inch and this one's a 12-inch model. They get very, very large. You can get them up to several feet long if you wanted. I find that most of the work that I do here in the woodworking shop, I do with my 8-inch. And the reason is, this particular tool I've had for probably in excess of 20, perhaps 25 years. This is one of the first dial calipers that I bought as a machinist. And I've just simply kept it all these years because it's a very good tool, it serves me well, and it's a very accurate tool. When I was transitioning into woodworking and so forth, and I started adopting some of my precision machinist tools into woodworking, this was the first tool that made that transition from metalworking into woodworking. Now, of course, they all do the same thing. They allow you to measure. Their variance is the depth or length at which they can measure. Working with the dial caliper is like working with just about any other woodworking tool. You have to hold it a certain way and manipulate it a certain way. Now in the case of a dial caliper, you're going to be pulling this component away, and that will of course rotate the dial around to show you your measurement. Now if you're going to measure something, such as the thickness of this board, you'll bring it in, and then using your thumb against the thumb wheel, you'll squeeze this area together to get your reading on your dial caliper. Now in this case, it's reading at 738 thousandths of an inch. That's the thickness of this piece of plywood. And of course, we're always told it's 3/4 inch plywood, but as you can clearly see, it certainly isn't. Reading a dial caliper is really a very simple task, and it doesn't require a lot of thinking. Here we look at one scale. This shows 700 or 7. That's 700 thousandths of an inch. Then we get to this point, we see that we've got 7 showing, and coming around on this dial, we see that it's at 39. So that's 739 thousandths of an inch. Each one of these graduations, as the indicator shows here, is 1/1000th of an inch. Now, machinists and other people that work with precision tools like this, we don't tend to think of 1 inch as our whole number. We tend to think of the thousandths of an inch as our whole. That's why we would say the thickness of this board is 739 thousandths of an inch. Now, many other people might read a dial caliper as 7/10 and 39 thousandths, and that's really not how it would be said in a shop, nor how you would read it. You would read it as 739 thousandths of an inch. Now, a digital caliper performs the same functions as the dial, except for it's yet even easier to read. Now, we'll start out by cleaning the faces. We'll close it up, and it's showing that it's reading 1/1000th of an inch right now. So I'll zero it to calibrate it. We open it up, and just like the other one, we close it up on the work, and it's showing 737 thousandths of an inch. So I'm getting a slight deviation from the other caliper. But either way, it's direct reading. We read the number directly off that digital readout there. We'll go back to the other one, and back to this one. Well, actually, they are reading about the same if I hold them the same and measure the board in the same place. But either way, 737 thousandths of an inch. So they both tell us exactly the same thing. Now, you might be wondering, what is a thousandths of an inch? How does this work into my world of fractions that I'm used to? Well, the first thing you'll want to do is understand the scale of a thousandths of an inch. How much is 1/1000th of an inch? It's hard to get a perspective on that. One of the things every one of us is familiar with in our lives is paper. We most probably touch paper every day of our life. Now, your basic bond paper, the stuff that you run through your computer's printer, or the type that you write on, is about 2.5 to 3/1000ths of an inch thick. It's giving you a very good scale as to what is a thousandths of an inch. A thousandths of an inch is essentially 1/3 the thickness of a piece of paper. Now that you've got a feel for what a thousandths of an inch is, now let's look at how it relates to our fractional system that we've been familiar with all of our lives. This is a 1 inch scale here. At the top is 0, at the bottom is 1 inch. So 1/4 of an inch is 250 thousandths of an inch. A 1/2 inch is 500 thousandths of an inch. 3/4 of an inch is 750 thousandths of an inch. Pretty straightforward. Let's look at it on the dial caliper. If we open it up, there's 250 thousandths, 500 thousandths, or a 1/2 of an inch, 750 thousandths, and of course 1 inch. Now on the scale down here, you'll see that it goes from 7, 8, 9, 1 as your 1 inch calibration. Then the little numbers start over. So in this case, this would be 1 inch. Or here we would be at 1 inch, 250 thousandths. Now this is at the large scale of things, where we're only working with 1/4 of an inch. Now if we drop down into the 1/8 inch realm, an 1/8 inch is 125 thousandths. Notice that 1/4 inch is 250, an 1/8 is 1/2 of 1/4, and notice that it's 125 thousandths. It's a very simple and logical system. Now we'll go down even further. Here's in 1/16 inch calibrations. 1/16 of an inch should be 62 thousandths. 3/16 would be 187 thousandths. So there's this chart or correlation between our fractions and our decimals. Now in every machine shop across the country, and in many woodworking shops these days, people have in their shops what's called a fraction decimal equivalent chart. Now on this particular chart, you can see over here we've got our fraction of 1/64th, and the decimal equivalent is 15 thousandths and 6/10ths. It's a direct correlation between our fraction and our decimal number. Now, as I mentioned, almost every machine shop in the world has one of these fraction decimal charts in it, and of course nowadays most woodworking shops have them too, because many woodworkers are now using dial calipers. But let's say you wanted to know what the decimal equivalent is of a fraction and you don't have a chart handy. Well, again, there's a very simple solution. So let's say we wanted to know what the decimal equivalent is of 11/16 of an inch. Keep in mind, all these are fractions. So if we take 11 divided by 16, we'll end up with 687.5 thousandths, just as we're showing here. So even if you don't have a decimal equivalent chart, you can quickly, with the calculator, determine what a fractional value is in decimal form. Now, for those of you that want a decimal equivalent chart, we'll be posting this one on our website in the reference section. We'll also put a copy of it on the DVD in PDF format so that you can download it and print it from your personal computer. Now, a moment ago we showed you that you can take the dial caliper and measure the thickness of stock. Now, when I'm planing my material at the thickness planer, I'm monitoring the thickness of my stock and measuring it with this dial caliper. What I try to do is shoot for 750 thousandths of an inch when I'm planing for 3/4 inch thick stock. I allow it to deviate about 3 to 5 thousandths plus or minus on that thickness. If I stay real close to that 750, all of my successive machining operations will fall into line very accurately. Now, what about overall dimensions? Well, if I take this scale, I can of course lay it on here, and if I look at my calibration mark here, it looks like this piece of stock is 4 inches and 11/16 long. That's what the scale's telling me. However, the dial caliper, when I put it on there and measure it, it's coming up at 4 inches, 678 thousandths. That's about 10 thousandths of an inch difference, almost a 64th of an inch. And that would be the difference between a good fit and a bad fit. Those 10 thousandths of an inch, essentially 3 thicknesses of a piece of paper, is enough interference to prevent 2 pieces of stock from fitting together, as in the case of a mortise and tenon joint. Now, the dial caliper is not restricted to simply measuring square stock. We've got a round hole here. If we take these inside diameter points, move them inside the hole, work the caliper back and forth to find the large diameter, we find that hole is 1 inch, 260 thousandths of an inch in diameter. So that's 1 inch, 260 thousandths. And that was most probably drilled with a 1 1/4 inch diameter Forstner bit. So we can use the dial caliper for checking the outside measurement and an inside measurement. But it's also more versatile than that. One of the things you'll notice about calipers is they have this probe that extends off the base of it. That allows you to measure the depth or depth feature of a component. For example, I'm going to measure the depth of this hole. Now, as you can see, I'm pushing it directly down inside the hole. I'll place the probe down at the bottom of the hole and then bring the base into contact with the face of the stock. The depth of that hole is exactly 381 thousandths of an inch. So we've got OD, ID, and depth measurement capabilities with the dial caliper. Now, of course, if there's a through hole, you can use your dial caliper to measure the diameter of that through hole. In this case, it's 757 thousandths of an inch, a little bit bigger than 3/4 of an inch. Now I've got some 3/4 inch dowel rod here. Your basic garden variety hardwood dowel, but it doesn't fit in that hole. Well, it's 3/4 of an inch, right? If I measure this hole with my scale, it says it's 3/4. If I measure the diameter of this dowel, it shows that it's 3/4. Why won't it fit? Well, let's actually measure what it really is. Well, here we go at 750 at its small point, but like most dowels, the largest diameter of it is 786 thousandths of an inch, 786 thousandths. So this is how much different it is from 750 to 780, 31 thousandths, a full 32nd of an inch bigger in diameter than the hole I'm trying to put it in. That's why it won't fit. Now, if this were, of course, a mortise and tenon joint, what we would have to do, of course, is start shaving this down or enlarge the hole until it fits. Or if this component was in fact actually 3/4 of an inch in diameter and in fact round, it would fit in that hole. Now again, backing up, the diameter of that hole is 756 thousandths of an inch. So if this were 750 thousandths, that at 756 thousandths would give us 6 thousandths of clearance for that dowel rod to fit inside that opening. Now, dial calipers to me are one of the best precision measuring tools that any woodworker could have in his hand. You're going to get a much more consistent, a much more accurate reading with this tool than just about any other tool in the shop, with the exception of a micrometer. Now, not only is this tool excellent for measuring, we can measure the diameter, the thickness, we can measure inside diameters, we can measure depth. We can do a lot of measuring with this tool, but we can also use it as a very precise layout tool. Now, one of the things that you'll notice that I use a lot, just by sheer accident, is that I work with these mechanical pencils with 0.5 millimeter lead in them. 0.5 millimeter works out to about 20 thousandths of an inch. So if I always work with a mechanical pencil with 0.5 millimeter lead, and I know that the lead is always 20 thousandths of an inch, it's not like a regular pencil where as you sharpen it, the point or the mark that you get gets bigger because it's a pointed or a tapered point. This tool, this drawing instrument, will always draw a 20 thousandths diameter line. So with that and my dial caliper, I can create some very accurate layouts. Now, if I want to either leave the line on my work, or if I want to cut away the line, I would either add or subtract that 20 thousandths of an inch on the pencil lead. But let's say I wanted to make a hole 1.5 inches over from the edge. Well, I'll bring my dial caliper out to 1 inch 500 thousandths, and I'll subtract my 20 for that pencil lead, or actually 10 thousandths in this case because we're going for the center line. So I'll set it at 1 inch 490 thousandths, lock it. Now you'll notice that I'm hooking it over the end of the board from the top edge. Now we can work from this point to this point just as we did at the bottom for measuring depth. In this case, we're measuring off the top for depth, or length in this case. So I'll make my mark right there. That mark at the center line of that line is exactly 1.5 inches. Now if I want that same mark going this way, coming up, and because I'm off, I'll come back. That cross point is exactly 1.5 inches from each edge of this board. You are not going to get more accurate than that with the scale. So as you can see, the dial caliper has more function than that of simply measuring. It can also be used very accurately and very precisely as a layout tool. Now, like any other tool in the woodworking shop, it does take some getting used to work with the dial caliper. It's not something you're going to pick up and instantly understand. I would say work into a transition with it. Start out by using it, doing comparative measurements between your scale and your dial caliper. As time goes on and you become more proficient with this tool, you will find that you're going to spend a whole lot less time going through the process of cutting a joint and then fitting it, and going into the method of work where you cut it to size and you know it will fit. For me, that was a profound understanding of what's changed in my woodworking over the last decade or so. Prior to that, I was like most woodworkers, where I would go through, cut my joints, then spend another hour, couple hours fitting up each of the joints with my block planes and chisels and so forth until everything fit just perfectly. Well, once I understood that we can actually measure wood very accurately with dial calipers, I bypassed that fitting up process altogether. Now, there will be some people that will try to tell you that you can't measure wood accurately because it comes and goes with seasonal changes. Well, that's simply very true, but not really applicable at the level that we're talking about here. When you're fitting up a mortise and tenon joint, for example, even if your mortise is a full 1 inch wide, the seasonal changes in that are very minimal over the course of a couple of days, during which time you're either machining the joints or fitting them to each other. So if you see a thousandths or 2 thousandths deviation because it got real humid on one day and it was real dry the previous day, it's not going to affect your precision at all. So if you don't have a dial caliper, you can pick them up at most woodworking stores, industrial supply stores. I would recommend that you avoid the really cheap plastic units. They work and everything else, but if you want a tool that's going to be durable and last you for a while, get at least a steel one. They're very economical these days. The digital ones, this particular model I picked up for $15, and it's very accurate. My 8-inch one that I bought, like I said, about 25 years ago, I believe I paid over $100 for it. It was money well spent. I've been using it all this time, and it's just been a great tool to have in my collection. Many of the dial calipers today are very economical. Many of them are imported from China, but they're very accurate, especially relative to what we do here in woodworking. I believe this 12-inch model that I purchased a few months back was only about $20 or $30 at an industrial supply house. So they are an economical tool, but they will change dramatically the way in which you do woodworking. You will soon find that you can transition away from that cut and fit into cut and knowing it fits. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. I hope you enjoyed this informational presentation on dial calipers, and I hope that you take the time to learn how to use one. And don't forget, we've got a decimal equivalent chart both on our website in the reference section and on the DVD for you to download.